Good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Gregorio, and I'm a political science major. My project is called The Framing Effects on Income Inequality, and my advisor was Professor Rossell. My research question is, what is the best way to frame income inequality as an important social issue to mobilize public support and pressure legislators into taking action? In politics, a frame refers to the heuristic packaging of an issue to either encourage or discourage different interpretations of a certain policy. So my project is important because it attempts to practically analyze the best policy options and evaluate them to determine how they can be presented to voters in order to resolve the problem, how to portray the solution. My methodology used an experimental survey which utilized Qualtrics software to look at a national sample of 385 people representative by age, gender, and household income. Participants were required to be in the United States and above the legal voting age of 18. So the economic policies in our country have resulted in a hyper-concentration of wealth in the top income level. The richest 62% of Americans own, the 400 richest Americans own 62% of our nation's wealth, and the bottom 47% have no wealth, which in other words means that their debts exceed their assets. So wages for most have stagnated in the last 30 years, while the income for the share of the top 1% has tripled. And wage stagnation is the leading cause of homelessness. So nobody likes poverty, and people usually want other people to succeed, obviously, and recent polling data shows that people are increasingly concerned about how income is distributed in our country. In November 2011, a poll from the Public Religion Research Institute showed that 60% agreed that our society would be better off if the distribution of wealth was more equal. Additionally, 63% believe that we need to dramatically reduce income inequalities between rich and poor, whites and blacks, and men and women. Perhaps the most important reason why Americans care about income inequality is that they believe it makes harder for people to climb the income ladder to get ahead. Achieving the American dream is more difficult when the rungs of the ladder are further apart, and in a 2009 Pew poll, 71% of the public agreed that greater income inequality means that it is more difficult for those at the bottom of the ladder to move up. And as you can see from this figure, America is in the middle of the pack when it comes to income inequality and social mobility. And this is in comparison to other countries that have market economies and a democratic system of government. So the graph shows that higher levels of inequality are positively correlated with reductions in social mobility. However, it's impossible to determine whether inequality actually causes reductions in mobility because there are many other contributing elements that are involved that vary between these countries that might also explain this correlation. Still, the figure signifies an important observation with significant policy implications. So these are the frames that I was considering with my survey, and just as a reminder, these are like a way of shaping the policy image in an attempt to influence public opinion. So the economic argument frame is the first real frame that I have here. The control was having none present before I asked the participants about the different policies. Anyway, the economic argument is based off research by Joseph Stiglitz, who has shown that economic inequality leads to greater economic instability and slower economic growth. Because while the top 1% took home 93% of the growth of incomes in 2010, households in the middle who are more likely to spend their earnings instead of saving them have lower real incomes than they did in 1996. Thus, increasing income inequality has hindered our economic recovery and continues to make our economy more vulnerable to the boom and bust cycles of volatility. And I hypothesized that this frame would be the third most effective because its logical appeal may be less obvious. And The public health argument refers to research done by epidemiologists that have shown that high levels of income inequality are positively correlated with increased rates of infant mortality, obesity, teen pregnancy, and lower life expectancy. And in addition, these higher income inequality even affects the health of more affluent individuals because it leads to increased rates of stress, fear, and insecurity in society. And I believe that the public health argument would be the least effective because it is the most causally dubious. So although the correlation between income inequality and these health effects have been proven somewhat, I thought participants might be the most skeptical about them because of how recently this research has been conducted, and also that they might believe that individuals have power over their own health ultimately. And I chose the moralistic frame because it has been shown congressional representatives are most responsive to issues with a moral or religious component. So my thinking was that if the public perceives income inequality in such terms, then legislators may be more apt to take action. So I included a quote from Pope Francis in the introduction to this frame, which is that our economy is unjust at its roots because it defends the autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation above all else. So my hypothesis was that this frame would be the most effective because of its emotional appeal, and especially for people with a specific religious preference. And finally, the Democratic argument was based off of research conducted by Martin Gillens, who's a political scientist, that showed there's a strong causal link between the preferences of high-income individuals and policy outcomes that are carried out by elected officials. So, and while the preferences of middle or lower-income people have essentially no effect on these outcomes. So this finding is significant because it shows wealthy individuals have more political influence, and as income inequality has increased, so has inequality in political access. In the 2012 election cycle, the top 0.01% accounted for 40% of all campaign contributions, which is an increase of 30% since 1980. And therefore, participants were told that income inequality should be addressed to reduce the corruption in our political system. I thought that the Democratic argument would be the second most effective frame because it directly links income inequality to corruption in our electoral system. These were the policies that I asked people about in my survey. And after I received the results from Stata, I recoded the answers that people gave me. So I changed the 3 for yes. Changed the answer of yes support to a 3, and answer of no or I don't know to a 2, or 1, and answer of no to a 0. This allowed me to construct an index of support for progressive policies to test the effects of the frames. So initially, when I began running my regressions, none of the frames appeared to be effective. Let me start over. I used the demographic information I collected to construct a series of dummy variables, which are artificial dichotomous variables created to represent an attribute with 2 or more distinct categories. These dummy variables included over the age of 45, male, female, white or non-white, Democrat or non-Democrat, college, no college, and whether or not someone owned a home, Protestant, Catholic, other, or no religious preference. And so yeah, here's the regression I ran, included all of the frames. So yeah, initially when I started analyzing the data, it appeared that none of the frames were effective in influencing people's support for progressive policies. I used the ordinarily least squares because it provides the best linear unbiased estimate for analyzing the relationship between the presence of the frames and levels of support for progressive policies. I used a regression equation to determine whether or not the frames had a significant effect. The p-values for the frames were close to the standard were not close to the standard threshold of 0.05 used for statistical significance, and were therefore more likely susceptible to the random influence of chance. This trend was not to be totally unexpected, though, because it can be very difficult to override people's preconceived policy preferences. So apparently the frames weren't effective enough to override people's original opinions, and this finding suggests that people will generally hear what they want to hear and aren't affected by framing effects. So wrapping the issue of income inequality in different frames does not clearly provide a stronger level of support for progressive policies. Thus, my results seemingly confirm the finding of political scientist James Druckmann, who commented that framing effects appear to be neither robust nor particularly pervasive and are often limited by elite competition and heterogeneous discussion. However, interestingly, one frame did have a more somewhat significant effect than the others. That was the democratic argument. When I dropped the other frames from the regression, it had a p-value of 0.055, which barely misses the traditional 0.05 level used for statistical significance, but the 0.10 level is increasingly more commonly used by social scientists as the cut point for statistical significance. However, the beta weight or standardized regression coefficient for the democratic frame was still lower than that of all of the demographic variables. In other words, although one might consider its p-value as statistically significant, it was overall of less importance than the other demographic variables in affecting a person's level of support for progressive policies. So therefore, my main finding is that demographic variables are much more important for influencing a person's support for progressive policies. And being under the age of 45 had a positive and very significant effect on the index, and the beta weight for the age variable showed it to be the second most important factor after income for determining a person's level of support. Interestingly, higher income and being a Protestant both had a significant and negative effect. However, an interactive variable that I created by multiplying being a Democrat with income showed that as people who identified as Democrats had their incomes increasing, so did their level of support for progressive policies, which suggests that they might have a greater willingness to pay for such redistributive policies because they're more able to afford supporting them. And finally, being a woman had a positive but less significant effect. More unexpected were the variables that turned out to be insignificant, which were going to college, owning a home, and actually being a Democrat. Perhaps a larger sample size would have shown these variables to have more significance. And although my findings were that ultimately demographic variables are more important than frames are for influencing a person's support for progressive policies, the Democratic frame, as I mentioned, was somewhat significant. And this means that legislators might first attempt to address income inequality through campaign finance reform, and future research might focus on how different frames can be used in this policy area. And perhaps there are different ways to present the issue that could have an even more significant effect on people's support for policy change. Thanks, that's all I have, and accept questions if you have any time. Yeah, there's 1 minute left. Anyone has a question? Yeah, Jacob.
Yeah, so, I find it interesting just that I guess everybody's so set in their ways. Do you foresee anything outside of just like appealing to campaign finance reform through a democratic frame? Do you see anything underlying that might be like a philosophical or like existential problem in terms of the way people approach each other and how we relate to one another that can be seen in different societies and different worlds? I mean, in different societies and different countries, and how that affects their conceptualization of income inequality?
Yeah, I think there's definitely, this perception of redistributive policies in the United States as being associated with socialism, which is somehow being negatively perceived as, taking away from those who have created jobs for others and therefore is hurting our economy, while the trickle-down economics are viewed as more allowing these so-called job creators to have more capital and means to create more jobs. But I think that these perceptions could be changed if people are made more aware of the effects of income inequality and how it is actually detrimental to economic growth. Yeah.
So this is an issue that I feel quite passionately about, and actually had the privilege of teaching at Hillshan in the freshman honor seminar on poverty. We called it Seeing Poverty. And the one bit of hopefulness, because this kind of makes me want to crawl under a chair and weep. So the one bit of hopefulness that I would say is that in my own work on income inequality and mostly just anti-poverty activists, storytelling actually does occasionally, not always, but occasionally help people empathize. And there's some really powerful and beautiful stories out there about the grinding impact of ongoing generational poverty. The problem is it's so easy, especially in a city like Boston, to never see the poor. So I think it's incumbent on all of us who have a mouthpiece, just like you've done here really nicely today, to tell those stories and expose those stories and shed light on those stories.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that there's a perception of the poor being lazy and undeserving of, help and incapable of managing the resources given to them. But I think that, as they share their stories and people become more aware of how pervasive the problem is and how, especially child homelessness is very more pervasive than it was 20 years ago, that people can become more generous and supportive of progressive policies, hopefully, in the future. Thanks.